Good morning and welcome to day 4 of Men's Health Connected. Today, our theme is hearing men's stories. So before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands where we meet from today. I'm joining you from the lands of the Gureng, the Garang, the Bunda Bunda and Balai mobs up here in central Queensland. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging across all of the traditional lands in Australia. So we've got a great couple of sessions lined up for you today. Today our focus is on men's lived experience, men's stories, and how that relates to our work to improve the lives and health of men and boys. How can ensuring more men's stories are heard make a difference in our work to tackle the many different health and social issues that face men and boys throughout life, from womb to tomb. One area where this work is fairly well established is in the world of mental health. So when we talk of lived experience these days, we often think of the mental health space, and that will certainly be a core theme we talk about. But when we're looking at this issue, we've got a bigger perspective, because it's not just about mental health and mental illness. Anyone who knows anything about mental health knows that will be shaped by a broad range of experiences like work and relationships, a whole range of social determinants. But then mental health also overlaps with our physical health. Just one example, having poor mental health increases your risk of heart disease. So we're very interested to hear a man's experience of heart disease just as much as we're interested to hear his experience of anxiety or depression. So while there will be a core focus around mental health and suicide prevention, part of what we're wrestling with today is how can we bring men's stories and experiences of all aspects of life into work to improve health, from policy and research, commissioning services, delivering services, and simply raising people's understanding and awareness of what the challenges are that men and boys face, and also to look at perhaps in what ways do men potentially face barriers in the lived experience space? Is the lived experience space an area that sort of is harder for men to be part of, or is it harder for certain groups of men to be part of? Men from Aboriginal backgrounds, gay men, men of working class backgrounds, whose voices aren't we hearing in the lived experience space? So I think there's a combination here, actually, really sort of celebrating the good work that's going on and what's working, but also sort of challenging ourselves and asking, well, whose voices are not being heard, whose voices are missing, and how can we bring those voices into the conversation? So the idea for the day is, in session 1, we just really wrestle around with what lived experience is, and we've got a couple of speakers who can help us with that conversation, but I'm sure many of the participants will also be able to contribute to that discussion. And then this afternoon, we've got some great examples of men who've taken their lived experience and are putting it into action, or they're working with projects that is putting men's lived experience into action. So that's the second session after the coffee break. So unfortunately, we've been hit by men's lived experience of health quite profoundly this morning, in that we had 4 speakers lined up and 2 have been hit by health issues. So that's lived experience right there, impacting our ability to bring people together for a conversation, which just means we've got more time and space to have conversations with everyone who's been able to show up for the conversation. But 2 people we've specifically asked to take part are Rob O'Leary of the youth mental health charity Batir, who we'll be hearing from shortly. But firstly, Tynan, I'm going to actually ask you to introduce yourself, because I know if I try, I'm going to mess up your surname. So T, as is known to me, Tynan, he'll give you his full name, who we know from Roses in the Ocean, which is a great organisation bringing lived experience voices of particularly suicide into the public and policy domain. In fact, Tynan actually joins us from Brisbane Airport, because it's a jet-setting lived experience. He's just been over in Coolum on the Sunshine Coast to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the work of Roses in the Ocean. So he's coming right from the front line of lived experience. Tynan, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Glenn, and good morning to everyone. Oh, my full name's Tynan Narawonchek, but a lot of people just call me T, and I'm comfortable with that. Look, I'd just like to start by acknowledging everyone being on here. And Glenn, you gave a really good introduction and really framed up some of the challenges that we do face in the space of suicide prevention and men. Why don't we speak? Why do some people speak? Where are the gaps? Where are we going with it? Look, to start today off, I'm going to share part of my lived experience, and from that, we'll sort of go into a bit, what have I done with it? Because the lived experience is all about, it's about an evolution. Like once you've got a lived experience, it does change over time as you build your knowledge and your perspective and you understand where you can fit it in. So my lived experience starts when I was 19 years old. So going back 19 years ago, I had a workplace accident where I fell 3 stories landing on concrete and effectively broke the right side of my body. And it was during the 3.5-year recovery phase that I basically had this scenario created for my future by the time I was 20, that, well, projecting forward, that when I was sort of in the age I am now, I'd be living in a retirement village, or I'd be living with my mum to be cared for, because I was deemed to basically not have the capacity to look after myself. I wouldn't have the capacity to be able to remember to take medication or to shower, or that I've eaten food and things like that. And over time, when you're getting that feedback constantly, it sort of to create this narrative in my mind that when the accident happened, that, well, actually something went wrong. Like I actually should have died during that accident, and me being alive was somewhat of an injustice. And over the months of receiving this treatment, months and years, it led me to a place where I had a permanent assessment to determine how the permanent extent of my injuries and my accident. And when I received feedback after going to this assessment, thinking I did really well and had proved the doctors wrong, I got this feedback that said I have 57% permanent impairment, and I had the IQ of basically a 5th grade child. That was really hard to take. And that sort of generated my thinking to go, okay, I sort of feel like something's going wrong and I should have died, to now I'm in a place where perhaps I need to take some action. And over a few months, those thoughts were with me. So thought of suicide. And one day I had a non-fatal attempt. And that to me was a massive realization, and something that I share with a lot of people is the fact that after my non-fatal attempt, the words that came out of my mouth time and time again to my dog, who I was sitting there with, was, I don't want to die. Like at no point did I want to die. I just wanted the pain to stop. And the pain that I was carrying was that pain of feeling like a burden on society, a burden on my friends around me, and not really having any control around that, because here you are deemed to be this invalid effectively at the age of 20, and your friends around you are out surfing, chasing girls, doing all the silly stuff that young men should do. And here I am sort of sitting there sleeping 16, 18 hours a day, not really having any purpose, just literally just thinking that I should have died. And it was a really, really painful experience. And it led me to a place where after my non-fatal attempt, that I effectively looked at it like I had a choice. I was given the gift of not dying, and then I was given the gift of perspective to go, okay, I've been through this painful place, but now I need to start a process to try and effectively find peace with that pain. And it's a journey that a lot of people go on, and I'm sure many people on this chat have experienced really, really painful things in life that have happened, whether or not it be an accident or family court or divorce. And it's no discredit to people if in that spot it becomes a place where it's, okay, I can't really see the alternative. But I was blessed to see the alternative and go down that road of, okay, I need to find peace for it. And for me, it led me to, well, effectively getting to know God pretty well, but also then becoming addicted to Ironman triathlon and traveling the world, getting to race Ironman races just for giggles, and then studying and building up this self-efficacy in myself to sort of believe that I could do things. But the thing that really stands out to me is it took 13 years after my non-fatal attempt to actually speak about it. because I lived in a place of shame. I lived in a place of, if I spoke about it, they would discredit everything that I did, and people would then have this opinion of me that would forever change the trajectory of my life, which it did when I spoke about it. But being scared to talk about it because of the stigma and everything that exists around the topic, I was just like every other man. I'm like, I don't want to sort of say that stuff, because then people are going to say I've got this mental illness, or I've got all this stuff, and I'm going to be labeled. And I didn't want to get labeled, but it was being invited to attend a Roses in the Ocean lived experience training in December of 2016 that I went along and discovered that I have this thing called a lived experience, which, I mean, the whole concept for me was like, what do you mean I've got a lived experience? Do I want this thing? Like, what am I going to do with it? But by understanding that I've been through things, and through the narratives of the process that I went through, there is so much tangible wisdom that can come from that. And to be able to learn to embrace my lived experience, but use it from a perspective of, okay, how do we use this to prevent? How do we use this to reach people? How do we use this to inspire people to have another go, to try different things, to inspire organizations to take on board the feedback that I can provide, the feedback that everyone can provide about the space, whether or not you've had suicidal ideations, whether or not you've been bereaved by suicide, you've cared for someone who's had suicidal ideations or a non-fatal attempt, or anything in between that. There is so much tangible experience that people can bring to combine to the statistics that we have, to combine with the recommendations of legislation and frameworks to go, okay, that's fine that we've put that in place, but let's come back to the people who have been through those things and experienced it. Let's talk to those people. Let's learn from them and try and really unravel the mysteries that sit behind it, and really bring it out of the shadows and bring it into an arena where we can have conversations. And I get excited every time I get invited to attend a meeting like this, because it's people like yourselves who are on here that really can be that change, and be that change for a variety of reasons that throughout your circle of influence. And yeah, it's pretty exciting. And once I found that piece, and I found my lived experience, I became hungry to get into the sector and to go after it as much as I can and just do whatever I can. And it sort of led me to what I'd say now is, like, I stepped into this phase of my life of really living my purpose. And I'm blessed to have just signed up with Roses in the Ocean. So I start full-time with them from 1st of July in a national role, basically doing peer care connect around the country. I've been involved in National Men's Lived Experience Network, which is through Glenn and the work they do. Again, just bringing the conversation for men to have a discussion about this topic of suicide and really understand what can we do about it, but also what can we do about it to prevent other men, prevent other people, our families and things, to see that if dark times do happen, which life happens to all of us, like we all have this cycle of life where things happen to us, and what can we do to make people feel comfortable to put their hand up and say, you know what, I'm experiencing emotional distress right now, and just to have that. And when you hear someone say that, and you sit with them and you hear someone's story, and you can say, look, I understand that what you've described to me, and I don't know what it's like for you, but it makes complete sense that you're having this response. It really just frees people up. So yeah, I'm so excited to be involved in anything around this. But I guess I probably won't jump ahead, but I was going to start to talk about some of the barriers and things that I've learned over the years. But I might just pause there and see if there's any questions that people want to ask, or if there's anything people would like to elaborate on. Lived experience is something that I've sort of started to deliver touch point workshops for Roses as well, which is a 4-hour workshop, combining the lived experience with effectively kind of like gatekeeper training, something along that line. So yeah, I'm happy to take any questions, speak more, speak less.
Yeah, no, Tyler, yeah, that's great. So that's a really good kickstart. Thank you. And I'm gonna ask you a couple of pointers, and then I'll come to Rob. So we've got Rob's story in the mix, and then we'll open it out. But firstly, thank you for just the ease with which you are able to share your story. So the very first question I want to ask is, what difference does it make to you that you are able to share your own lived experience with such ease with so many people?
You know, the first time I shared it with Ronnie and the team at Roses, it was the most bizarre experience. I'd spoken probably, I'd say maybe 5 times in the 13 years before about my non-fatal attempt at suicide. And I was like everyone else, like I used all the wrong language and sort of downplayed it. But I would only do that after I'd had a few beers and it was later in the morning or something. When I went and spoke at Rose's, I think there was 10 people in my group, and we went around, we all had 2 days to basically uncover our lived experience and then tell it to the group. And I went first and I stood up and I tried to speak and I couldn't. Like, I just had this in my chest. It wasn't pain. It was just like something that I'd been carrying that I didn't even know I was carrying. And I'd been carrying that for 13 years. And when I spoke about it that first time, that lifted off me. And I often think when people carry things around, like I'm sure you've all seen that analogy where you hold a glass for like a minute, but if you hold it for an hour, it gets really heavy. But I'd been carrying that around for so long, and when I first spoke about it and I saw the reaction, and Bronwyn just went, "You can share that story. That's going to reach people." And I went, "Really?" And to uncover that, okay, this was my experience, but I can make this about me or I can make it about other people. And so every time that I get to share my lived experience, I just think, okay, there might be one person who hears that. There might be one thing that resonates to that person. And for me, I just go after it. I'm like, I think that's why I've become comfortable. And I've been speaking now for probably 5 years and spoken at a variety of events. But I think to be honest, Glenn, like for me, it's literally that thought, maybe I can impact one person's life every time I speak. And that sort of motivates me. It takes the focus away of, am I going to get my words stumbled up? Am I going to like miss something out? It's like, no. You're having a good opportunity here to speak to people and speak into a topic that through my lived experience, I truly am an expert matter on. So subject matter expert on. So
wonderful. Thank you. So as we pick at the question, what is lived experience? In the very first instance, it's just men telling their story, right? In the simplest possible terms. But then actually there's ways of telling the story which actually make a difference to you as an individual. So that ability for you to tell your story in a way that lifted this weight off your chest after 13 years of keeping it to yourself and the shame that you felt. So when men are able to tell their story in a way that's properly heard, then it can have a real healing effect.
Definitely.
This is my word, yeah. So and then beyond that, so that's we've all got stories. So that opportunity for everyone is potentially profound. But then beyond that, then having learned to tell your story, you're then able to share your story in a way that starts to make a difference for other people. So in some way, lived experience is about sharing your experience in a way that helps others.
Yeah, definitely. And there's so many different angles that when you truly look into your lived experience that you can unpack, and it can be even identifying what things helped, like when you were having suicidal thoughts, like were you carrying it all the time? And for me, it was the power of like connection. And like I sometimes speak about my good friend Simo, and Simo would come around and see me pretty much every day. And he was an electrical apprentice, and yeah, he'd just come and sit with me. And some days it might be a weekend and he might sit there for 8 hours. I won't say a word to him and he'd just speak to me. Sometimes I'd ignore him completely, or I'd be rude to him and I'd walk away. But by having Simo come back and forth, that meant so much to me. Like, even though there wasn't that acknowledgement, and that's what I was going to say to people. It's when you're the friend or you're the person supporting and you feel like you're not doing anything for that person, simply having that presence, simply being there and asking someone a question, and sometimes like even framing up and just saying, look, mate, I understand like life's been really tough for you. Are you thinking about suicide? Like, to even ask that question, there's so much power in that. And I don't think you may offend, people may get offended or respond like they've been offended. But to be honest, if you get asked that question, it's more so that it's like, I don't know, you feel loved. You're like, wow, they've really just asked me that question. They must really, really care about me. And yeah, you can't underestimate the power of that human connection.
Beautiful. Thanks, Tynan. We'll be coming back to you, but that's a wonderful way to start the day. So Rob, will come to you now. So Rob's at Batia, a mental health charity for young adults. And a really simple question, Rob, what is lived experience to you, and how are you guys approaching lived experience at Batyr?
Yeah, so for us, I mean, lived experience, we look at lived experience of mental ill health more broadly. So people that get involved with our programs don't necessarily need to have a diagnosed mental illness, but to have had some experience navigating difficulties with their mental health at some point in time. To a lesser extent, we also would include kind of carers and supporters within kind of having a lived experience of supporting those with their own challenges as well. So yeah, that's kind of how we would look at it. But yeah, I guess before I launch into this as well, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on, which is the Darug and Guringai people. I want to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. So as Glenn mentioned, I'm Rob O'Leary. So my role is the Lived Experience Program Manager at Batyr. And for those of you who've never heard of Batyr before, we're a for-purpose preventative mental health organisation that was created and driven by young people for young people. So we deliver evidence-based programs in schools and universities that aim to reduce some of this stigma around mental health that Dave was talking about, and empower young people to reach out for support when needed. We primarily do this through lived experience storytelling and peer-to-peer interventions. So this idea of lived experience is really something that's embedded in everything that we do at Batyr. And the Being Heard program that I manage trains young people aged 18 to 30 to give a voice to their lived experience in a safe and impactful way, not too dissimilar from the work that Roses in the Ocean does. And then many of these young people go on to share that story as a core part of our programs, our campaigns, and different initiatives. But yeah, given the theme of today is about sharing men's stories, I also thought I should give some context to my own experience and how I came to be at Batyr. And so the roots of my family tree are wrapped up in a broad range of different mental illnesses: schizophrenia, anxiety, depression, and suicide. And so in my teens and early 20s, I struggled with depression, anxiety, and substance use. And also a lot of my mates were going through similar things at the same time. Unfortunately, we lost 3 people from our year group to suicide, 2 of which were men. And the support that we received around that at the time was quite limited. And I can now see, like in retrospect, how stigma, those negative beliefs and attitudes that we have towards mental health played a role in us just not talking about it. When I graduated high school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I didn't have that sense of purpose, but my mum was working as a mental health clinician, and she suggested that I study social work. So it was interesting because as I started learning about different forms of psychological treatment, like your CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, I realized a lot of what I was learning was already really ingrained in me from the way that my mum interacted with us growing up. And so I feel quite privileged that I was equipped with some really practical strategies to help take charge of my mental health from a young age. After graduating, I then worked at an inpatient mental health unit. I was with a community crisis team, and then I worked as a youth access clinician at a local Headspace centre. After about 2 years at Headspace, I got asked to speak on a panel for a youth forum that Batyr was facilitating. And this was really the first time that I was exposed to seeing young people sharing their lived experience in a really constructive way that left me with a sense of hope and empowerment. So the young people didn't just talk about the challenges, they spoke about how they were able to navigate them, and also the people in their life that supported them through that journey. So like Simo, as T just mentioned in his story there. So for me, that was such a refreshing take on things, and came at just the right moment in my life, because I've been working in the kind of pointy end of mental health, and I was kind of reflecting back on how much we would have got out of hearing from similar stories, when we were all going through things in high school. So it wasn't long after that I then made the decision to leave Headspace, and I got a job coordinating Batyr's Being Heard workshops. And then I moved into my current role about a year after that. So I've been here for about 6 years now, but I'm still constantly blown away by the incredible stories of young people. And I've seen firsthand the impact that these stories are having in the community. Our workshops, it's not too dissimilar to what Roses is doing, as I said. So it's quite it's a surreal feeling for a lot of people. We essentially bring together a group of strangers, a lot of whom have never talked about their mental health before, except with close friends or family or a mental health professional. And then we're training them to share their story as a short narrative that's told in a way that's going to be safe and going to be impactful. But we're also quite intentional intentional about trying to have people from all different walks of life there, so that people can learn from one another's story. And through that process, people start to realize that they're not alone, that there's common experiences that connect us all, and that by being vulnerable and choosing to share our stories, we can give other people permission to do the same, or to reach out for support when they need it. So yeah, it's funny, like it's often quite hard to get people out the bloody door at the end of one of these workshops, because they build such strong connections, and it's such a unique experience. Like we just don't sit down and have open conversations around mental health in this way. And after attending our workshop, so 98% of the people who come along feel confident sharing their lived experience. 99% of people believe that their story is worthy of sharing and of being heard. And 100% of people then believe that their story can have a positive impact. Essentially, the work that we're doing is based off the research of a guy called Professor Patrick Corrigan. He's a bit of a guru when it comes to all things stigma reduction. And so he said that the way to create the greatest behavioral change when it comes through stigma reduction is through contact-based interventions, or this lived experience storytelling. And he found that it's particularly effective when it meets certain criteria. So it's targeted, it's local, it's credible, and there's continuous contact. So we know that an audience is going to be more likely to engage with storytelling when the speaker is someone who's relatable to them. And so at Batyr, we go to great lengths to ensure that we're targeting speakers to a particular audience. Ideally, it's someone from the local community that's going to be credible. So like if we were running a program to an all-male cohort at TAS in Armidale, we would send a male speaker, but preferably we would send someone who's from the local community that understands local challenges and that local experience. We're also not about starting this conversation as a one-off. So wherever possible, we want to be following a cohort through from like year 9 to year 12 with a suite of follow-up programs. But we also look to set up chapters in schools and universities so that students can play an active role in changing that culture and reducing stigma in their community. Recently, so we've crossed over the threshold of training 1,000 participants through the program, and we've got about 200 speakers nationally who share their story as part of the programs that we run. It's interesting when we look at men though, because men make up a smaller percentage of our numbers. So about 30% of the people that have been through our workshops are male, and it accounts for about 36% of our active speakers at the moment. And I mean, what I was going to chat through, there's some parallels with what T was chatting about there before, but I've learned that with promoting the workshops to men, that often they don't want to do it to share their story for themselves. They do it because they think that they can help someone else through doing that. And so that's something that we really lean into when trying to get men involved. I guess this idea of giving back can be seen as a significant step in recovery or maintaining well-being. So to be able to transform what had been a negative experience into something that could be positive or constructive for someone else. And that's often like the driving factor behind why people get involved, and men in particular. So we've run male-specific campaigns. We've delivered all-male workshops to try and make the experience as accessible as possible. And we've seen a lot of success with that. But it's also worth mentioning, as I was saying at the start, like people don't need to have a diagnosed mental illness to take part. They also don't need to have an experience around professional help seeking. We're interested in stories of all kinds. We know that there's barriers when it comes to men accessing professional support, and that there's often a high percentage of people who drop out of services prematurely. So we also have a lot of stories where it's men talking about how they're able to take charge of their own mental health, or how they accessed informal support. So talking to friends, family, it could be a teacher, it could be a sports coach, these different people that can help us navigate tough times. And so we've learned that through delivering all these different stigma reduction issues, there are certain core elements that should be present to ensure that we're having this impact. So I was keen to kind of chat through some of our learnings around that as well. And the first thing is this idea that vulnerability breeds vulnerability. So Batyr was essentially created when one person made that decision to be vulnerable and share their lived experience despite the stigma that existed. So our founder, Seb, he felt that stigma had prevented him from reaching out for support when he needed. And he thought if he just heard from someone else, he wouldn't have felt so alone through doing that. And so he went back to his old high school, he shared his story there, and things just snowballed. He then ran the first Being Heard workshop, which at the time was called Batyr Anonymous. It was kind of like our take on AA for mental health. But now, we've reached over 300,000 students across the country with these stories of hope and resilience. The next thing is around safety. So when whether we're sharing a story at like a program or it could be online in a media article, it's really important that we're having a positive impact and not causing harm. So all of the stories shared through Batyr adhere to best practice guidelines around how to communicate about mental health in a safe way. So examples of this might be using person-centered language or avoiding using stigmatized language. And importantly, not just focusing on the challenges, but also some of the positive aspects of people's journey. So how they're able to reach out for support or how they take charge of their mental health today. And similarly, it's equally important to create a safe space for people to actually learn how to share their story. So we do this by empowering people to make informed decisions about their participation based on whether or not they're in a good place with their well-being. So ideally, people who come along to our workshops will be connected with support, but we also have a mental health professional who's there on the day who can support them through that process of writing and sharing their stories. We ultimately want to be preventing re-traumatization. And so we encourage people to be mindful of things like anniversary dates and also just make it really clear that people can opt out at any stage that they want. And the last kind of tip is this idea that value goes beyond recognition. So we need to recognize the expertise, the effort, the time, the strength that it takes to get up and share these lived experience stories as well. I think like remuneration is always preferable where possible. So all of our speakers through Batyr are paid as paid contractors, but I understand that's not something that's always feasible, but it is important that it's, you know, never tokenistic, that people are engaged in a way that's really meaningful. And, you know, obviously as Tia was saying, you get a lot of value out of just being able to have a platform to share your story and see that tangible impact that you're having on others. So I think, you know, we've seen a lot of positive change in the past 10 years that Batyr's existed, but there's a lot of work that has to happen. So 3 out of 4 suicides in Australia are men. I think there is this bit of a myth, though, that men don't reach out for support. I think that's the stereotype that's often doing more harm than good and perhaps perpetuating the problem. So while men tend to reach out at lower numbers than women, overall, the help-seeking rate for men is increasing. But at the same time, the suicide rate is also going up. And one of the explanations for this is that the system isn't made with men in mind. So there's been studies that indicate that 60% of men who suicide have actually sought help in the year prior. And a couple of years ago, I don't know, people are familiar with Dr. Zach Seidler from November, but he surveyed 2,000 men who had been in counselling. 43% of them had dropped out prematurely without informing their clinician. And that increased when looking at young men. So that went up to 50%. And I think that's a really important issue that needs to be addressed. And so one of the things that Batyr is trying to do is to harness the collective voices and stories of young people to really advocate for change. And so over the last couple of years, we've been working with young people, with mental health professionals and researchers to design and build the Our Heard app, which is a digital storytelling platform. We've got support from the Australian Government Department of Health to do that. So essentially, this platform allows young people to create, view, and share safe, relatable, and engaging stories about navigating tough times. But the really cool feature about this is that it's got the capability to then gather insights from this collective experience of the story creators to then inform policy, service improvement, and the training of healthcare professionals in a meaningful way. I mean, essentially, this app's dependent on us building up a large database of stories, but in theory, what we're trying to do is to collect data in a meaningful way to then inform and improve the mental health sector. So, for example, if we had enough stories from Dubbo, we could analyze that data to paint a picture of, okay, what are the barriers to young people accessing support in the community at the moment? What are the things that's actually working for them? What are they finding useful in terms of professional or informal supports, but also other practical self-care strategies that they're utilizing that's working for them as well. So yeah, that's a little bit about us at Batyr and kind of what we've been up to, but also the power of storytelling for men and more generally as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rob. I mean, how much juice and good information was there in that? Loads. I want to pick out a couple of points there. The point about men are more likely to come to a workshop if they think they can help others. That just reflects what we find over so many areas of men's health. In the literature, it's known as, and I always have to adopt an American accent to say this, it's reciprocity. It's reciprocity. If I can give something to someone else while I'm getting help, then I'm more likely to get help. And there's just loads of examples of that actually playing out in the real world. If you go and do a talk about men's heart health and how to look after their heart health, not many men will turn up. But if you do a talk about how how to save a mate from heart attack, you'll get blokes there, and they'll learn about heart disease in the process. Our friends at Marcus Mission in Queensland, when they started running workshops for younger men in the Queensland area about taking care of your mental health and preventing suicide in yourself, no one turned up. The moment that they said how to prevent suicide in your mates, a full room. So there's, and I think we've got men's sheds here from Victoria. Hillary, a friend of mine who was very involved in men's sheds in the early days. The whole thing about men's sheds is that you get support from other blokes whilst doing something shoulder to shoulder. He said the first men's sheds that he worked in Victoria, there were 20 blokes, and if you ask those 20 blokes why they were there, 19 of them would say, "I'm here to help the other blokes." So yeah, all of them were getting help. So that's a really interesting point, obviously, which is practically proving true. But that sort of, if we're able to empower men to share their stories in service of others, they can also then be more likely to access the benefits that they get from sharing the stories for themselves, potentially. So we need men to know that their stories are valued and valuable.
Yeah, for sure. And like, to jump back to your story as well, T, like I've seen that experience so many times at workshops. It's like people don't actually realize the benefit to themselves until they do it. Like, so, promoting it as a way to help others is a great way to get people in the door, but then also they have this transformative experience themselves, and that validation that can come with being able to have an impact.
Great. And there's just one more point I'd like to just as a throw in as well before we move into more of a conversation, and I'm sort of saying this in the bit when you were talking about the value of having a workshop and being in a workshop with people from lots of different backgrounds. So it's not just getting to know your own experience better, but you're learning about the experience of others. I wanted to have a conversation about consumer health engagement here. That's why our colleague Dr. Anthony Brown from New South Wales Consumers Health would have been a fantastic contributor. Unfortunately, not well enough to be here. But that's where people more in the physical health space, where health consumers are sharing their experiences to shape the way that health services are delivered around cancer, for example, or heart disease, or whatever, diabetes, whatever it is. And 2 points from that space. One is, men, again, very underrepresented. So I think about 70% of consumer advocates in health are female generally. But one of the points that's always stuck with me from talking to Anthony is how he talks about when you're training people to be consumer advocates, there's sort of the three levels: the ability for them to tell their story, the ability of them to tell other people's stories. So to be able to say, well, I haven't been through that, but I know someone who has been through that, and this is what they told me. And then the ability to tell our story, which is to be able to be representative of the patient or men or whatever. And I think that's a real sort of takes lived experience to another level. That's that I'm able to tell I've got this core set of skills which enables me to speak on behalf of me, but also on behalf of my peers, and also on behalf of all of us effectively. So yeah, do you? I think your focus is on telling my story mostly, though, right?
It is. I mean, the way that we frame it is that, you don't need to have a diagnosed mental illness to come along. It's just anyone who's had challenges with their mental health or who has supported people. But I could probably count on one hand the amount of times where people who have come, to exclusively talk about the support that they've provided to someone else. Yeah.
Yeah. Gotcha. Brilliant. Okay. So I'm really fascinated to hear from. I'm dying to share my own story and my own experience, but there's other people in the room. So I'm really interested just to hear some feedback, comments, experience from in the room, and see what comes up. So just wave your hand or open your mic and jump in if you want to contribute, share your experience, ask any questions, please.
I had a few things. Thank you for your stories. Oh, Rob and Ty. One about the young person's app. I've got teenagers, and I actually researched with some of their male friends who they'd reach out to if they were feeling suicidal. And they explicitly said that they wouldn't talk to a teacher or the wellbeing officer, but they're much more likely to talk to their peers or go online. So I think that's a great thing, particularly for young people. And the other thing was, as far as stigma and shame, I think normalizing suicidality is actually quite a common human experience. Particularly to have suicidal thoughts can really help, reduce some of that shame, and reinforcing that even though they don't feel like that now, things do get better. Yeah, so that was it really.
Right. Thanks. And Annie, you're a peer worker. So
yeah, so I am a peer worker. So I've in suicide prevention. So I felt stuck, like it's all too hard. I've never attempted suicides. I've always at that stage, because I've got kids, are a preventative factor, got help. But I do know what it feels like to feel so dark that there's no way out, and stuck.
Well, thanks for sharing your story, Annie, and being here. And for those who don't know, because this is another aspect of how lived experience can be used, what is a lived experience peer worker? What do you do in that role?
Me?
Yeah, what is a peer? Could you explain to people who don't know what a lived experience peer worker does?
Yes. So, well, in my role, it's really about supporting people in that sort of reciprocal relationship. So the relationship's a key thing. Letting people know that I have got experience in mental distress, and really listening to that person and sharing, as appropriate, stuff that's helped me and might help other people, or even just saying, I get that, I felt like that before.
Gotcha. Yeah, so this is an area of lived experience work which is certainly developing more now, the recognition that people with lived experience can make great peer workers, and it's an area where more money has been put into to support and develop the workforce, and also make sure that there are people in paid roles doing that, and it's not just people who are getting burnt out doing it voluntarily, as can often be the case, and certainly has been the case in the past. I'm going to come to John, and I'll come to Julie. John, do you want to introduce yourself and then share what you want to share?
I've been non-video for a while, and I did my hair this morning, so I don't mind turning on my video. But so lived experience. Hey, I just thank you again. I think what you're to hear you, Tynan and Rob, is fantastic, and I just want to sort of throw a point in there, hopefully without taking too much time, and that is that 85% of practitioners in mental health are females, and it, as a broader issue, that men oftentimes choose female practitioners because they're more sensitive, and because they're possibly more qualified. There's certainly more of them, but in the process, there's then is this, hang on a moment, do they understand who I am? They're a female, I'm a male, and other things start to come into play, which make it quite complicated. How do you get a male in the room when there's a female practitioner there? And it makes a huge difference, because to be, in my own experience, and I believe in others, to be validated by another male made my journey not just a female journey, but it made my journey a valid male journey. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to, how do we actually then make sure that females are supported in their work with men's health? And I guess I broaden that issue to what you're doing, because so many people haven't gone to the extremes that you haven't been able to come back to find the space that you have to contribute as you have been contributing. How do you capture that for people that haven't gone to the lengths that you've done, so that they can then have you in the room with them?
Yeah, great. We'll pick up that thread, which is we could have a whole session on, John. Thank you. And just let us know where you're coming from, John, so people know who you are in the room, by the way.
Beg your pardon. I'm John Rich. I'm the chair of the Men's Health and Wellbeing in West Australia. Men's Health and Wellbeing in West Australia is a peak body. for men's health in Western Australia. So trying to promote organisations and people and anything to do with men's health. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks for being here, John. Great to see you. This early in the morning, it's practically still sunrise in WA, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Oh, it's 7:30, 8:30. No, so we're starting to wake up now.
Good. I'll come to Julie first, and then we'll sort of come back to our speakers. Julie, good morning.
Good morning, Glenn. How are you?
Great.
I don't know if you can see my video. I've hit start video.
We're just getting your avatar at the moment. Yeah.
Not that you really want to see me.
We'd love to see you.
I'll
go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. And I really want to thank Rob and T for absolutely gold information and the personal stories and just so much. And I'm working DVA at the moment, Department of Veteran Affairs, and I'm in community support, and one of my team members is on here as well. And I just, with that also personally, a daughter of domestic violence in a rural area, and working in a private girls' school, and having brothers and all sort of that pathway, like many of us on here, different pathways. And it's so encouraging to hear. And there's so many standout aspects of men needing other men just to listen, and how they communicate very differently. And I'm a big advocate for men's health, because then it has obviously a knock-on effect for women as children, as partners, as sisters, etc. And women want healthy men. Domestic violence is on the increase, and it's layered with culture, and whether it's a ADF side of things or that's sort of not talked about. And my point I just wanted to bring to probably the table, and you'll probably cover it later, is where in the curriculum can we start with young boys, and not just at teenage, young boys? We've got religious studies in school, which happens. And I ideally would love to see something in the curriculum for boys and girls, separately understanding relationships and what's healthy to be, what those aspects are and when to reach out, and that mental health is normal, not abnormal, for a start. And also, as a community, I think we have to roll us as a community, as we know, and what happens at home, we can't always control. When you go back to that environment, if you have a role model outside of that, and I think Annie said about some children not feeling comfortable to talk to teachers, is it the peers that are constantly at the school, or, that consistency, building that trust, not just a one-off. And we have to ingrain it early into what's our largest hit point, and that's probably schools, and I think just redoing that narrative. And then obviously what social media is something we can't really control. And, in schools we get taught about how much pornography boys watch, and that's their idea of, could be their idea of, that sort of sexual, connection to women again, and how women are treated. So my point is it something that's talked about? Is it something that, in the perfect world could happen?
Gotcha. Thanks, Julie. We'll try and pick that up. So I'm going to come back to Robin Tynan for a little bit. The first area I'd encourage you to sort of pick up on, Robin Tynan, is an aspect of John's question, not necessarily the gender piece straight away. I'm actually interested. He also touched on the difference between having support from a peer, someone who's actually been through something similar to what you've been through, and having a support from a clinician, irrespective of whether that's male or female, right? So firstly, just any thoughts you've got on the value, and it also sort of taps into the work that Annie does as well as a peer support worker. So I'm really interested in hear your thoughts when it comes to support. How important is it to have access to peers, and what is the tension between help from peers and help from clinicians?
I'll start. And the evidence and the feedback I've had from discussions with doctors around that topic is that when someone comes and talks to them, in most cases, unfortunately, it's at the end of a consult, and doctors then, they don't have the time to sit there and go through a mental health care plan or have a full discussion about about what's happening, which for doctors, it can be quite confronting and something that plays on their mind as well. And the statistics that Zach Seidler presented last year, like, they shocked me. And I recently just asked you to get the studies for that, because it came up that, yeah, a large majority of men had actually been in front of a GP, and to really understand that, that's significant. Like, that is a significant shift for men to actually be in a place where they look at that vulnerability. Oh, sorry if the noise is bothering everyone. So yeah. To actually have that. And in terms of the gender difference, I haven't heard real, like, GPs are a respected person. So if someone goes there, like, I haven't heard any impact that whether or not the doctor's male or female in terms of being a barrier. It's still more so just starting to have that conversation, to have a peer, someone around you that comes along the journey. And it can be quite a hard journey for people to be that peer if they're not informed, because sometimes as the peer, you think, I have to fix this for people. And it's not about fixing, it's about listening, and it's about being supportive of that person. And that's a big shift that we sort of need to do in terms of society as well, in terms of that stigma, is that if someone comes to you for help, they're coming to have a conversation. They're not coming for the answers. And in many cases, they don't have the answers, but it's what can you do to have that, to start the narrative going and start the conversation, even just get people to, okay, look, what's one thing that we can do? Like, what's one step that we can take? What are we going to do next? Who do we need to speak to? What has happened in the past? Like, what has helped to support you? From a peer perspective, when someone receives that, when they receive that conversation, non-judgmental, and a space where they can just speak what's on their mind, it's not, like, again, it's not about fixing, it's just about listening and making someone feel valued.
Right. Thanks, Tynan. I'm going to jump in on the gender one, because it's a question that we get asked all the time. And for me, it's certainly true that both men and women can be ineffective at supporting men. So it's not, the ability to effectively support men is not the exclusive domain of men. It's also true that if you go into a mental health or social care space, you're far likely to be seen by a woman than a man. And that, from a diversity perspective, is an issue. So there's a question of how do we get more men into the mental health and social care profession. But it's also about how do we ensure that those practitioners have actually had training in how to deliver gender sensitive support. I was at the conference in Brisbane, suicide prevention, last week, chatting to a woman who's worked in suicide prevention for 20 years. She's been involved in our work for a few years as well, very sort of interested and committed to male suicide prevention. And so I just did some training specifically on working with men last week. I didn't realize how much I didn't know. So, and that's a concern, and that's somewhere we can make a difference, right? We can actually get training informed by lived experience into the sectors, so that the men and women who are working in the helping sectors are better equipped to help men. So it's not for me about having less women helping men, it's finding ways to get more men engaged, whether that's as peers or whether that's as actual sort of trained professionals. So I hope that sort of addresses that. From my perspective, and I'll come back to you, Rob.
Yeah, no, thanks, Glenn. And I would certainly echo everything you just said around that. But jumping back to the value of that peer work piece, because I do think it's something that complements clinical work quite beautifully. And I think at least the way that we talk about, being a peer worker or the peer voice at Batyr is that we know when talking to young people, they don't want to be told what to do. And so the way that young people share their stories is told in a way where others are able to learn vicariously through their experience. They're not actually explicitly saying everyone needs to go and see a psychologist, because different things work for different people. And I think, there's so much value in just having someone who gets it, who's had that experience, someone who can role model that you can live a perfectly fulfilling and satisfied life with this mental illness or with this experience. And I know that there is a big push, like certainly in New South Wales Health, I know they've shifted towards getting not just peer workers in their mental health facilities, but also young peer workers. And I believe Headspace is looking at doing the same thing. And like, just as a practical example, one of our speakers about a year ago had a decompensation in their mental health. They were went into hospital and came out with their new diagnosis of bipolar. And so they were also a medical student. They're intimately familiar with, what that diagnosis means, but they called us up and they're like, I really just want to talk to someone else that has kind of been through this. So is there any of the other speakers that have been through a similar thing, just so I can have a bit of a chat and just know that I'm going to be able to kind of manage through this?
Right. Thanks, Rob. I'm just going to park the point about education to come back to. I want to hear from Jeff, who's got his hand up. I'm also interested, before you start, Jeff, I'm also interested to hear from John, who's made a great comment down in the comment section. If you can be on standby, John. Jeff?
Jeff Lawrence. My lived experience, as Glenn knows, is that I'm 6'4" tall. And when I grew up, I was told that basically that was not acceptable. And I actually used to physically walk with a stoop so that I would physically fit into the narrative that I had learnt from other people. And I guess a metaphor in my life has been living up and being my full size. And as part of that, I did a master's degree some while back in the area of storytelling and spirituality, and helped do a workshop on narrative and mental health pastoral care. What I've heard today, just to highlight some of them, are these. We've talked about storytelling, but the corollary of what we've all said but haven't actually named is the power of story listening, and that the work that we're all doing is engaged in story listening. And what we're saying to people in a world so time poor, you're worth the time of day. You're worth my time, and I'm prepared to give you my time just to listen to your story. And that's just powerful validation in itself. But one of the other things that, that happens in all this, and T highlighted this when he said, my circumstances had created this narrative, I'm paraphrasing you, T, and then I started living into that narrative. And so what we find is that a lot of people have been given these stories, just as I've been given this narrative about my height and lived into it. A lot of us have been given these narratives of who you are, where you belong, what your value is. And a lot of the work that we actually do in, from my experience in men's groups, is not changing people's stories, but we're helping them to reauthor their story and actually to find the story of their true self, and not a story that they recreate or create from different fantasies or other narratives, but what's their true story. And that takes a long time, as people have to go through all the trauma and relive some of the pain, and just having the strength to be their full and true self, which is why I've rephrased that statement we hear from South Africa. It takes a village to raise a child. Well, it takes a community to heal a broken heart. It takes a community to heal a broken spirit. So I'm just sort of feeding back what I've been hearing today of how we often live into the story. So in one way of putting it, often I'm not telling Jeff's story. I'm telling the story that other people tell about Jeff. I'm telling the story that I've learnt from other people. And part of my journey has been growing into my own story and into my full self. And just one thing that was mentioned today, but I think one of the guys on Tuesday, when he said guys coming to their health thing, and after a while they've been able to touch their toes. And it highlighted for me that celebrating with people just the simple work, that touching your toes doesn't seem a huge victory, but for some people, all the work they did in getting to that point. So it's also celebrating the victories and just acknowledging to someone that was really good work. So sorry, that's more of a talk rather than personal sharing, but it comes out of a little bit of what I'm doing and my passion for story listening and helping people in the reauthoring of their story and just being there for a mate. Thank you.
Beautifully told, and I'm sure beautifully heard by the room as well, Jeff. So yeah, thank you for giving us the opportunity to hear your story. John, are you there? John Milham? I thought the point you raised, and I'd love you to repeat the point you made in the box, in the chat box.
Yeah, I am, mate.
Great.
Forgive the attire. I'm just getting some hospital downtime. So, love men's health. I'm living it right now. Yeah. So I just thought I'd put in there, having just also spent some time in zooming into Queensland on lived experience forum conferences. It's just so important that people recognise lived experience is not as not just like beautifully put by Jeff as a narrative that it's our story. It's the story of recovery. It's the story of pathways to better policy. It's the story of how to implement a strategy for people to avoid the worst excesses of what we call mental well-being or mental health or mental fitness, right? It's actually a story that's relevant, not just because it comes from me and it's about me, but it's relevant to all of our journeys in some way, right? That's how men have always handed around the fire, handing out the wisdom that they've hard won on the battlefield or the hunting paddock. So I really think lived experience needs to be part of our platform. As Zach Seidler tells his clinical story, but from a lived experience point of view, that's why he's so powerful. And I would recognise the necessity of other clinicians at a local and PHN and state level to start talking in the voice of lived experience. Otherwise, they're not going to be as relevant as we hope and need them to be. That's just I hope that's okay.
Well, no, it's perfect. I didn't know you were going to be joining us in your lived experience clinical 90, but that's thank you for sharing it in such raw and authentic attire.
Mate, that's me, right? If you can see it, it's going to be me, mate, putting it on. There you go.
Beautiful.
Great.
Well, look, take care of yourself, whatever's going on for you there, John. There he is, helping others.
Too good to miss.
Obviously, also needs to be taking good care of himself. Good on you, John. I'm going to pick up the key point there that I wanted to pick out from what John was sharing was about how lived experience can go beyond healing an individual, how it can go beyond helping others at that sort of localized level of you share your story with others, or you talk with others, to actually changing what happens at a sort of a policy level and a practice level. So what are your thoughts on that, Tyne and Rob? What do we need to do, or what are we doing already to make sure that men's experiences actually bring about that bigger change at the level of policy and practice?
Yeah, so look, I think there's been a lot of great work that's been done insofar as like setting up different advisory groups that are informing a lot of kind of campaigns, a lot of service improvements and that sort of things. I spoke a lot about our Herd app that we're developing, and I think there is a lot of power in being able to not just look at the individual experiences, but that collective voice to see what we can learn from that to be able to advocate for change as well. So one of the things, though, that I'm conscious of, at least within the mental health sector or the youth mental health specifically, is that even with these advisory groups, like they're going into inform program design, delivery, research, all these different activities that are happening, but it's the same people that are sitting on, your Batyr advisory group, your Headspace advisory group, your Reach Out advisory group as well. And it's like the voices that are missing are those that are less engaged or as confident in wanting to be an advocate as well. And I guess that's the challenge that we're struggling with at the moment. Like, how do we bring in those who are less engaged into those sorts of positions where they can be making meaningful decisions that are impacting the system more broadly? Yeah,
brilliant. Thanks, Rob. Tyne?
I'd say in terms of the policy, the space, I'm extremely proud of what is actually happening, and that is, like, I get invited to PHN meetings quite regularly to have the voice of the lived experience aspect there. And Roses have just released a suite of resources like Designed It, lived experience principles. How can you embed lived experience within your organization, within your structure? And it'd probably be great to like maybe even share that at some stage down the line. But I presented to the PHN in Cairns, brief overview. They've jumped at it, and now to the point like they've had meetings now and they talk to me all the time. They say we really want to embed this. And to be honest, I think the first part is actually setting up a lived experience, like a reference group with people who are adequately trained so that they can share their lived experience from a variety of different aspects, but they can do it in a way that's safe for them, that's not going to put them at risk, but it's also then going to validate like that lived experience part. And I love what Jeff said too about the story, like listening. And like at Roses, we always listen. Everything that Roses is built on is about listening to people's lived experience, listening to like the stories that they've had, and combining that with the knowledge and the statistics, and going, okay, let's combine these two. And it's when you put that knowledge and the wisdom together that you really create that synergy that you actually can have a massive impact in changing things. I think like it's, and to be honest, like I probably 5 years I've been involved in suicide prevention, and the amount of change and the amount of difference that has happened across the variety of the spaces, like from top level government all the way down to grassroots things, it's massive. Like it's so big, like the groundswell of activity that's happening. And I think it's just patience. Like we want everything done, but it is starting.
Great, thanks Tynan. We've got a couple of minutes left. If Phil Lamport is still in the room, he posed a really nice sort of final question to ask, but also I would love him to introduce himself and let us know where he's coming from. Are you with us, Phil?
Yes, sir. Thanks, Glenn. Yeah, I suppose just looking at the topic of the talk, and I'm quite the one for writing down quotes and bullet points as we go. So my question really is to the speakers: do you have any main bullet point takeaways of what is lived experience? You know, what should we be looking for? How do we define it? Really anything that helps us determine what is lived experience that we should be including.
Great, thanks, Phil. Who wants to take that first?
Do you want to go, Rob, or do you want me?
You can start if you want.
So, all right. Look, a lived experience, to define it, it is anyone who's had a non-fatal attempt at suicide, who has had suicidal ideations, has been bereaved by suicide, has cared for someone who fits in that sector. They're all the people who have a lived experience of suicide, and it can be anyone. I mean, you meet, there's stories that I've heard about taxi drivers who effectively they've got such a wealth of lived experience because they drive around and they'll have people that will just start crying, and some of these taxi drivers will be like, oh, okay, tell me what's going on. Oh, I'm thinking about suicide. And that's a lived experience right there. So it doesn't have to be just like your family. It can touch you in so many different ways. I'll throw over to you now, Rob.
Yeah, no, I think that is a great summary, and it is a hard thing to define. It's defined differently, you know, across different sectors. But I mean, we've spoken a lot about the lived experience of suicide or of mental ill health today, but I think it equally applies, as Glenn was saying at the start, like we could have a lived experience of heart disease or, you know, a whole range of different health things. And so, yeah, it's just anyone that has had a story to tell about navigating these different experiences, and how do you leverage that story to be able to help others or to improve the systems that are impacting that thing.
Yeah, great, both. And yeah, I would just re-emphasize that. So the lived experience voice and the use of it is most well developed in mental health and suicide prevention, but it can apply to any other area, not just of health, so heart disease, but to social issues. So, you know, I know, Phil, you're dealing with separated dads. Men's lived experience of going through the family courts is just as valid as men's lived experience of having depression. And we're not very good at this stage of making sure that men's lived experience of going through the family court is informing how the family courts are reformed and improved, as you know. But there's something for people working in that space to learn from how people in the mental health space have approached lived experience. And yeah, we can talk more about that maybe later when we have someone from your organization this afternoon as well. But yeah, and it's also then lived experience for me isn't just about telling your story. It's the ability to tell your colleagues' stories and the story of the group that you represent. And it's not just about going out and sharing stories to help others. It's also about sharing your experience to inform research, policy, and practice. So it's a really big field, actually. It's a really big field. And then, yeah, that's it. We've hit 10:45. It's been a wonderful session. We've heard so many stories and bits of experience. I feel like as is so often the case, I feel like we've covered so much and at the same time only scratched the surface. But thanks particularly to Tynan and to Rob for getting the day off to such a great start, for being so open and honest with us in terms of, and authentic in terms of sharing their experiences, but also giving us a flavour of the great work that the organisations that they are connected to are involved in. Tynan mentioned within that we do have a MHF in partnership with Rose in the Ocean, have a budding national men's lived experience network. If you're interested in getting involved in that, drop AMHF a line and we'll hook you up to it.